Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody, depending on which time zone you're joining us from today. We are absolutely delighted to have here with us today Dr. Rebecca O'Connell and Professor Julia Brannan from the University College London Institute of Education, who will be sharing with us a presentation on families and food in hard times, which covers comparative research that they have done across communities in Europe, namely dealing with the UK, Portugal, and communities in Norway. My name is Catherine Bailey and I'll be moderating this session, and I'll just share with you really quickly a few words about what GODAN does before we pass over to Rebecca and Julia. So Global Open Data for Agriculture and Nutrition supports the proactive sharing of open data and knowledge to deal with the urgent challenges of ensuring world food security and zero hunger. We have at the heart of GODAN a network of over 1,200 partners from governments, private and public sector organisations, and we focus on building high-level support among governments, policymakers, international organisations and the private sector. We promote collaboration to harness the growing amounts of open data generated by new technologies in order to solve nutrition and food security challenges. So hence our interest in this topic of food poverty or food insecurity in developed nations as well. So that is a little bit about us. You can find out a little bit more at www.godan.info/about GODAN. And if you do have any questions, then you can contact either myself or Sushit Anand, our chief scientist, who run the working group on food poverty in the context of which we are doing this webinar. So Rebecca, if you're ready, I believe that you have the first presentation to share with us.
I do, thank you. And I shall try to do that now. Okay, can you see and hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, lovely, thank you. So I'm going to start and then Julia's going to take over and I'll do the slides. So just wanted to begin by saying welcome and thank you so much for having us. Thank you to Catherine and Suchith for inviting us today. Julia and I are going to present today drawing on our new book, but the research was carried out by an international team, as you can see in the slide. And for the talk today, we decided in discussion with GODAN that we would focus on the methodology and a few of the main findings from the project. We obviously can't do justice to the 5-year research project in this very short talk, but we do hope it will provide some food for thought and a basis for discussion. See if I can move the slide. There we are. So we're going to give the talk in 3 parts and there'll be a little opportunity for any questions or discussion after each part. I'm going to begin by saying something about the background to the research and setting it in some context, and then think about how we conceptualise food poverty in wealthy countries in the research. I'll go on to talk about the research design and how we conceptualise households as resource units. And then in part 3, Julia will discuss some of the main findings from the research, and we will reflect on the current crisis in which we've finished writing up the book. So to begin with, given GODAN's international reach, we thought it was important to start this talk today by saying that whilst our study focuses on food poverty in the global north, the greatest maldistribution of resources is between the West and the rest. The majority of the world's hungry people live in the global south. These 2 photographs are taken from an incredible book that you may know called Hungry Planet that documents what food and drink is consumed in 1 week by 30 families living all over the world. In some ways, this isn't a good comparison, given the very different circumstances in which these families are living. The Abu Bakr family are refugees. They're dependent on emergency food aid. But what they do show is the extreme contrast in the food to which families have access. And they highlight two major drivers of food insecurity globally that are poverty and conflict that constrain people's access to and entitlement to food. The pictures also depict what data from the Food and Agricultural Organization tell us, that there are vast differences in levels of household food insecurity at the regional level. So according to FAO estimates based on their food insecurity experience scale, in 2017, around 30% of people in Africa were exposed to severe food insecurity. That means they had to reduce the quantity of food they ate, they skipped meals, and they experienced hunger in the past year. In North America and Europe, this is around 1.4%, or it was in 2017. FAO data also show that it's families with children who are generally more affected than those without. But there are also stark differences within regions and within countries, and that's the focus of our research and our talk today. Hunger has always coexisted with banquet in rich countries, but in times of economic crisis, levels of inequality and levels of food poverty have risen markedly among some groups within the global north. For example, in the UK, large-scale research, including our own analysis of the EU statistics on income and living conditions, has identified a sharp rise in food insecurity from around 2010, as we'll go on to discuss. And in the current crisis, official statistics from the UK government, published in March, show that over a quarter of households who are in receipt of universal credit are ranked as having very low food security, and that's more than 6 times the national average. So this new photo on the right shows this stark contrast between the food of families living within the same country. This photo was taken by one of our research team in the home of a family who took part in our project. This is most, but not all, of their food. Some was kept in the fridge, which was also in their living room. Like the Bainton family on the left, the family includes 2 parents and 2 children, but this family is living in very different circumstances. As a family with a mother who is undocumented and therefore excluded from working and from welfare support, they were not typical of low-income families in the UK in general. However, they were among the poorest in our sample, and they demonstrate, first, that absolute poverty does exist in one of the world's richest countries. And second, the contrast illustrates an intrinsic aspect of the experience of food poverty in rich countries, that of want amid plenty. So moving on to how we conceptualized food poverty in our study of food of 3 European countries. The first thing to note here is that the issue of how poverty and food poverty are conceived, defined and measured are highly relevant to the measures that are taken to address them. This means that they're also a highly political issue. The second thing is that central to poverty and food poverty or food insecurity is the acknowledgement that it involves deprivation in a basic need for food. But the way in which we think about and define and measure poverty and food poverty has changed over time and in different places. So, for example, an influential way of thinking about poverty that emerged at the turn of the last century in the UK was that of Seabohm Rowntree, who identified a subsistence level, which was essential for physical efficiency. Later in the same country, Peter Townsend's notion of relative poverty emphasised the social as well as the physical necessities of life. In the United States, qualitative research by Radimer and colleagues has highlighted the multi-dimensional nature of food insecurity and how it's a managed process. And of course, these feed into widely used measures like that of the USDA and the FAO Food Insecurity Experience Scale that draws on it that I just mentioned. Importantly, these ideas are reflected in the notion of the right to food that the UN Special Rapporteur defines, as you can see in the slide. This emphasises not only enough food for physical sufficiency, but also the importance of dignity and freedom from shame. So these broader understandings of food poverty recognise something fundamental about poverty and also something fundamental about food, that it's deeply symbolic and part of the fabric of everyday life. In the words of the anthropologist Audrey Richards, for humans, food acquires a series of values other than those which hunger provides. As sociologists and anthropologists ourselves, we understand food to be, of course, a fundamental source of nutrition. It's vital for health. It plays a major role in health inequalities. But we also know that it's a fundamental source of pleasure. Indeed, it's been one of the few pleasures that some of us have been able to indulge in during the lockdown. And it's fundamental also to personal and social identity, to social solidarity, and of course, to social exclusion. So finally, for this first part, when we set out to examine food poverty in the 3 countries, we have thought about it in relation to these 3 different dimensions. In understanding food and its materiality, we recognise that it's a source of nutrients and that food poverty involves eating a reduced quantity and often a reduced quality of food. For example, fruit and vegetable intake may be reduced or compromised, and emphasis may be put on eating foods that are filling rather than nutritious. We also recognise that it's material, food is material in another sense, in the sense that it's a resource that has to be managed and distributed within the household, with different members having different entitlements, and that food poverty entails this sort of fairly predictable sequence of planning dwindling resources. The social dimension, as I've said, is also fundamental. If food is a basis of belonging, it's also a basis of exclusion. And this is something that's particularly relevant for young people, as Julia will go on to say. Finally, we were interested in the psychosocial or the emotional dimension. So this includes worry about running out of food, not knowing where the next meal is coming from, but also feelings of shame and the experience of stigma relating to being unable to fulfill social obligations. That's it for part 1. Kate, do we want to have any questions now, or shall I carry on? I'm not hearing questions, so perhaps I'll keep going.
Oh, I'm really sorry. I was actually replying.
Oh.
I didn't turn my microphone on, which was really helpful. At the moment, we don't have any questions in the Q&A function. So if I can just remind our participants, please, if you have any questions at all you'd like to put to our panelists, then please leave them in the Q&A function or in the chat and we'll get to those. But Rebecca, that was a really fantastic introduction to your work, and it would be really great if you could continue just for now. Thank you.
Yeah, I will do. And hopefully we'll leave more time for Julia's part where we get to the findings, which I think you'll find interesting and perhaps have some questions about. So I'll move on. And in this second part, we wanted to say something about the research design and how we conceptualize households as resource units. But before I move on to discuss that, I want to say a few words about the historical context in which the study was conceived and funded. So we designed the project in the wake of the last major global crisis, sometimes referred to as the Great Recession, that began in 2008 and was primarily caused by deregulation in the financial industry. In this context, some governments introduced so-called austerity measures that were ostensibly designed to reduce financial deficits and in reality reduce the welfare state and people's expectations of the welfare state. At the same time, there were global fluctuations in food prices. Of course, these had the biggest impact on the lowest income families, for whom food represents a larger proportion of their budgets. So it was in this context, that sometimes is referred to as a perfect storm, that national and international media were beginning to report an increase in the number of children arriving at school hungry, a marked rise in the number of food banks handing out food parcels to families, and families being forced to choose between heating and eating. But at the time, whilst there was a growing body of research on food poverty in the global north, we didn't know enough about the extent of food insecurity in the UK and Europe, or about differences between countries or within households. There was a marked lack of attention to children's experiences. So at the international level, the research tended to be sort of to use statistical household level data, whilst the qualitative research was at the national level and, for good reasons, focused on the experiences of mothers. But as researchers at the Thomas Coram Research Unit, where we specialise in policy relevant research on children and families, we wanted to address this gap. So our overarching aim was to examine what difference social context and social positionings make to the extent and the experience of food poverty. We adopted a realist ontological stance. So from this perspective, the world is constituted by the empirical, so what's experienced and observed, the actual, the conditions that shape everyday experiences and behaviours, and the real, the powerful causes that lie behind observable patterns. And in contrast to strong social constructionist approaches that see qualitative research as merely giving voice to research participants' subjective perspectives, we see our jobs as critical researchers to describe, understand, and contextualise the realities of people's everyday lives, not only how people see the world, but the social conditions and causes that shape those experiences. So to do this, the study adopted an international comparative approach and a mixed methods embedded case study design. More on this in a moment. And importantly, it included the experiences of young people using both qualitative and quantitative data. In terms of the countries, these were selected to provide for a contrast of contexts in relation to conditions of austerity. So we focused on Portugal, a southern European country, where poor families and children appeared to have been most affected by cuts that were imposed as a condition of their bailout. The UK, which imposed substantial cuts in welfare and benefits to poor families, and Norway, which in comparison with most societies is highly egalitarian in terms of income, and with its sovereign wealth fund buffer was less affected by the crisis and not subject to austerity measures. To say a little bit more about what this multi-layered approach meant in terms of the methods and data, I should have said at the heart of the research was the qualitative research with 133 families. So there was 45 families in the UK and Portugal and 43 in Norway, with an 11 to 15-year-old child and a parent, usually a mother, interviewed in each of those families. So we took a long distance, a medium distance, and a close-up view of low-income families. Methodologically, this meant working analytically at 3 different levels: the national or international level of welfare states, the meso level of local institutions and informal social networks, and the household level, in which parents and children act on and convert the resources they access in order to sustain their families. And this design was based on research that Julia had done with European colleagues on a previous European project. At the macro level, we were really interested in the policies and the discourses of government and how they targeted and impacted on different groups of families. So in terms of the data and the methods and the data, this involved carrying out secondary analysis of large-scale surveys. So we, the statisticians on the project, the quantitative researchers, carried out secondary analysis of the EU statistics on income and living conditions and the health behaviour in school-aged children study, both of which covered the 3 countries we were interested in. And at the national level, we examined budget standards. We were interested in budget standards, social security systems, labour market participation, and so on. So we reviewed national surveys, official statistics, reports, literature. We carried out analysis of newspapers over time to have a look at how the discourse is around food poverty, the discursive context, and how it existed in or whether it existed in the popular imagination and narratives. At the meso level, we were interested in the kinds of institutional support, such as schools and services, as they affected access to food, and the informal social networks that were available to low-income children and their families. So in terms of methods and data here, this meant writing field notes about the locality and the residents, access to shops and so forth, writing about school food, researching and writing about schools and school food policies, and about third sector services. And we used schools and third sector services in localities to help us to recruit families. So we carried out some informal interviews with people there too. And finally, at the micro level, we were interested in parents and children's practices to feed themselves and their experiences, their narrative accounts of living on a low income, what these meant in terms of hunger, dignity, feelings of social inclusion and exclusion. So we carried out in-depth interviews with a child and a parent, and in a subsample of families in each of the countries, we carried out visual methods as well. So this involved a kitchen tour with a researcher and the child taking photographs for us of food and eating in their everyday lives. And Julia will include a few of those pictures in her part of the talk today. So finally from me for now, I just wanted to say a few words about the shape of the samples of the families who took part. You can see photographs at the top, and these are of the different study areas in the 3 countries, the UK, Portugal and Norway, which, as I mentioned, I don't know if I did mention yet, but the families were drawn from 2/3 of the sample in each country was drawn from the capital city, and 1/3 was in living in a rural or a semi-rural area. All of the families that we recruited were subjectively living on a low income. This means that they had less money than they needed to make ends meet. All of them, of course, included a child who was 11 to 15 years who was willing to talk to us too. In terms of the family type, around 2/3 in the UK were lone parent families, and about 1/3 in Portugal, and in Norway it was about half and half. And in terms of family size, there was roughly the same number of smaller and larger families in both the UK and Portugal, with slightly more larger families in Norway. And in terms of ethnicity, around 2/3 of the mothers are British and Portuguese, with around a third were first generation migrants in those countries. And again, in Norway, that was reversed. So no, this is the final one from me. So I'll just say something about the qualitative analysis and our approach to thinking about households as resource units. So our approach was inspired and informed by the work of feminist sociologists, including Julia, who since the 1970s have opened up the black box of the household and the family to look at resource distribution within households as well as between them. And within households, we were really interested in the work of domestic food provisioning, as Marjorie DeVault has called it. So this is a concept that kind of bridges the public and the private domains, and it includes all the aspects of the visible and the invisible work involved in feeding the family. So not only cooking, but planning, procurement, preparation, as well as managing surplus and waste and cleaning up. So these are some of the kind of questions that we set out to answer in analysing families as cases. What kinds of resources are available to particular low-income families in the 3 countries? How do parents transform these resources into food through their domestic food provisioning practices? What do they eat? Who goes without? And how do they make sense of their experiences? So finally, to address the question of what difference social context makes, we then carried out another layer of analysis. So we identified and compared families living in different places who were similar in some respects. And in the book, we focus on these groups, which have generally been the focus of policy interest, or in the case of undocumented migrant families, have been excluded from social research as much as they've been excluded from society in general. So that's it from me for now. In the next part, we have some moments for discussion if we have any questions, and then Julia will talk through a few of our findings. So I'll hand over.
Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. There are actually a couple of questions before you disappear.
Yep.
So we have one here from Runak, who is asking, what are the challenges, if indeed any, of recruiting the participants for the study? And were there any incentives provided, or did you have a contact point to help you recruit?
Thank you. It's a really good question. Yes, it was very challenging. Julia might want to jump in here as well. I think it took about 18 months to 2 years without looking back at the book, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was something in that order. So we did expect it to take a long time to recruit the families, and that was for a number of reasons, really. We were looking for quite a specific age group of children. So we decided to focus on families with an 11 to 15-year-old child, because our understanding was this was an important age at which children and young people begin to have some independence and perhaps be able to expect to be able to meet up with peers and so forth outside of school. So we thought this would be an interesting age group to look at, and they've been relatively ignored compared to younger children. So we were looking for quite specific families. Of course, they needed to be subjectively on a low income, and they also needed to want to talk to us. And I think the conditions in the 3 different countries affected how easy or difficult it was to identify those kinds of families. So it took longest in Norway to recruit the families, and it was relatively quicker in Portugal, I think both because levels of poverty in Portugal are much higher anyway, and there was a bigger research team. So we used a range of different ways of getting in touch with families. Initially, we sent out a self-completion questionnaire, short screening questionnaire, to families with children in that age group via schools. And I think it was something like, in the UK, 700 questionnaires went home to families, and in the end, by the time we got them back and decided who met the criteria and who was willing to talk to us, that ended up with about 16, a handful of families that we recruited that way. And then we used other methods of recruitment. So the researchers, in the UK, Abigail Knight, who's not with us today, did much of the qualitative research, and she spent time in a little bit of time in a food bank, recruited some families that way through local non-governmental organisations, charities, and through snowballing. So and in Norway, I think Facebook was used as a recruitment method. So we used a range of different methods, really, and it was challenging. In terms of incentives or thank you gestures, we did offer those. sort of say in the book, you know, we recognise that there are differences of opinion about whether that's ethical or not. It was our view that it is ethical and proper to thank people for their time by giving them something in return for taking part in this kind of research. So yes, we did, and we decided between us as an international team what would be most appropriate in the 3 different countries.
I think I'd just add to that
yeah.
You know, all families are difficult to recruit, and the more sort of rigorous your research design and the more specific your criteria always makes it more difficult. And it's, you know, it's good methodological practice to you know, to basically to follow those criteria.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering, because there are a lot of different
Lost your voice, Catherine.
sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello. There are a lot of different cultures across Europe, so it's probably one of the areas in the world that's richest in cultural differences, and of course a lot of difference as well between those countries in terms of social and public sector structures. Could you perhaps tell us a little bit more on how you came to the decision of using the 3 countries that you featured in your study?
Yeah, so as I said, really, initially the kind of the justification for selecting those 3 countries was that they provided this contrast of context in relation to conditions of austerity. In addition, you know, Portugal is a southern European country with a different sort of welfare state, been known as a familius welfare state, which compares to the UK, which is, you know, much more individualised and more neoliberal, with Norway being a contrast there. And you know, pragmatic decisions as well about wanting to work with particular research teams and researchers who had expertise and interest in the topic. Julia, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that's, you know, the gist of it, really.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We don't have any more questions for the moment. And if I can just remind our participants to leave any questions that they might have in the question and answer and chat functions, and we'll get to those in a moment. So if you're ready, then please do continue. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, everyone. Lovely to be here, and thank you for asking us to take part. As Rebecca said, we collected different types of data in order to create this multi-layer led view and understanding of food poverty. And so at the national level, we collected quantitative data from the European Union Statistics of Income and Living Conditions Survey. And the point of this was to identify which families in the 3 countries were, first of all, most at risk of income poverty, and those who were most at risk of food poverty. And we analysed these surveys over time, both before and after the 2008 financial crisis and their ensuing austerity measures, in order to see what the effects of the crisis was on food poverty. And just to give a glimpse of this, on income poverty, families in the UK were much more likely to be income poor in all 3 countries. Sorry, lone parents were much more likely to be income poor in all 3 countries than couple households. On food poverty, the rates of food insecurity were the highest in the UK, contrary to the income poverty, which was very high in Portugal, even higher than in the UK. But on food poverty, they were lower. And Norway, unsurprisingly, food insecurity was the lowest of all. In Portugal, also interesting, that couple families were equally likely as lone parent families to be food poor. But the UK lone parent families were, the gap between was very great between couple and lone parents. And lone parents in the UK over time were consistently most likely to be food poor. And in our microanalysis of the 133 households with children, we also look for other characteristics of these groups. And we identified that those who were at risk of food poverty also tended to be lone parents, but most affected were, as Rebecca mentioned already, the migrant families who in the UK had no recourse, those who had no recourse to public funds. We also found those at risk of food poverty to be parents in low-paid work, often on 0 hours contracts. And in Norway, we found the new migrants, those who came to Norway under the refugee quota system, to be at risk of food poverty. And these were typically reliant on the basic level of social security because they had no employment records in Norway. Next slide, please. A fundamental part of food poverty is exclusion from participation in customary food-related activities, as Rebecca's already said. And we found that around 1/3 of the mothers we interviewed said they couldn't afford to allow their children to have friends home for something to eat. The same proportion of young people also said they didn't socialize with friends in activities that involved food and eating. And in many ways, this was one of the saddest parts of our research. Because of this lack of social participation, some young people describe feeling different, feeling excluded, feeling shamed, and feeling stigmatized. And not being able to hang out with your friends, for example, in the UK, buying chicken and chips, as, you know, in a takeaway shop, is particularly painful in a highly consumerized society like ours here in Britain. In the book, we describe families who've lived in poverty for many years or for all of their lives. As this lone parent, unemployed mother, Lauren, who lived in a coastal English town, said, "There've been times when I can't even offer my children's friends toast. There've been times of a weekend when I've been like, I'm really sorry, I haven't got toast for you even. I feel like, I don't know, if it's the northern blood in me, but when you cook dinner, you cook for everyone in the house." While some mothers said they were used to not having a social life themselves, they also said they made great efforts to ensure that their children didn't miss out altogether. In Lauren's case, she described how she bought her son some sweets that he said that he was really wanting. And another group of families that we identified had recently experienced a fall in their incomes. And these families, we noticed, tried to sustain their former customary food practices and social lives, thereby maintaining a semblance of normality for their children. On the whole, these families were better resourced, culturally and materially, to withstand the shame compared with the long-term poor. For example, one family went to great lengths to organize a birthday party for one of their children by negotiating for free the use of a local cafe and bringing their own birthday cake along with them. Next slide, please. Children, one of our key findings is that children suffer both the direct and indirect effects of food poverty. Around a quarter of children we interviewed went without enough to eat on particular occasions, a similar number in each country. And this occurred despite the fact that the mothers had told us that they typically sacrificed their own food intake, skip meals, for example, so that their children could eat more. The indirect consequences of food poverty were manifest in the study, and this 15-year-old boy we called Emmanuel, whose mother had no recourse to public funds because of her lack of legal status as a migrant. He experienced difficulty concentrating in the classroom. He said, sometimes you don't have enough energy. You can't cope in the classroom. So you have to try and rest a bit. You just put your head on the table and you end up falling asleep in the classroom and you get in trouble for it. Even more worrying, he described an episode when he collapsed from the pangs of hunger. The young people we spoke to usually seemed very aware that that money was short at home. Some expressed being very worried about their parents. Some of them normalized the feeling of hunger. I'm just getting bigger, so I need to eat more. Others describe moderating their own desires and expectations, not wanting expensive things like their friends had. And one strategy in the interviews was to play down or to deny that they were missing out. Instead, they made excuses, for example, why they didn't mix and eat out with their friends on particular occasions. Next slide, please. We were interested in the part that school meals play in the lives of children in low-income families. And we found that free school meals can protect children from some of the worst effects of food poverty. This was noticeably the case in Portugal. Almost all the children in the study were entitled to a free or subsidized 3-course meal at lunchtime. You can see an example on the screen. And according to national guidelines, this was meant to include soup, vegetable soup, a main course consisting of meat or fish or equivalent, a dessert, typically fruit, and water. All but 4 of the children in the study qualified for a free or 50% subsidized school meal. And this substantial meal was in some cases also supplemented by free snacks. And in part, we think, because of the school meal system, children in Portugal reported the highest consumption of fruit and vegetables compared to those in the UK and Norway, those in our samples. At the other extreme, young people in Norway had to bring a packed lunch, as most Norwegian schools don't provide a school meal service. Indeed, the Norwegian culture sets great store by eating cold food, usually sandwiches, at lunchtime. However, the cost of food, including bread, is very high in Norway. And this adds to the financial costs for parents who've got large families, especially the new migrants who relied on the basic level of social security. In the UK, the situation was different again. Eligibility for free school meals is linked to the receipt of certain means-tested benefits. This, in effect, means that most children whose parents are in low-paid work were ineligible. only half the UK sample received a free school meal, and 4 of these were ineligible because their families had no recourse to public funds. But even the young people who were eligible for free school meals said they found the meal allowance insufficient to buy enough food to satisfy them. Moreover, some said the system stigmatized children who were on free school meals. Maddie, a teenage girl, said that people on free school meals, children on free school meals, are restricted in the items they're allowed to select, a small baguette rather than a large one. She also said, worryingly, and the way the canteen's set out, like everyone can see what you're doing and everyone can hear and stuff like that. So the lunch staff at the checkout was like, you can't get that, you're free school meals. Next slide, please. Rebecca talked about what constitutes food provisioning, how we understood it, all the different tasks involved. And we asked mothers in a number of different ways about how they managed on a low to do it on a low income. The first thing to say is that mothers are the primary managers of poverty in everyday family life, as studies over the decades have shown. As Ruth Lister has written, mothers living on low incomes get by in ways that protect their children. A second thing to say is that food work, especially for those on low income, is exceedingly hard work. And just to focus for a moment on one aspect of food provisioning, food procurement or getting food, accessing food. In our research, we found that the local context could make a great difference to this. For example, being able to access places in the neighborhood where there is free food or cheaper food was relevant. This means that mothers on low incomes managed in different ways with greater or lesser difficulty, depending on what was in the vicinity. For example, whether there were street markets, whether there were food banks nearby, whether there were small ethnic shops, what the possibilities were locally for growing or obtaining homegrown produce, exchanging with neighbours, for example. In Oslo, where a majority of the sample in Norway lived, the city's accessibility to the Swedish border was a key resource for migrants in particular, although white Norwegians also go to Sweden for cheaper food. And many talked about making a monthly journey by bus to stock up on things like halal meat and other products that they could take home and put in their freezers. So the local area, cost of transport, these things were very important budgetary considerations in accessing food. So there's a lot more in the book, but those are just some tasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. You talked about the gap between lone parents and couples in different countries in terms of poverty. Why or what do you think it was that caused such a big gap in the UK and perhaps a lot less of a gap in Portugal?
This is a gap in food poverty. I mean, Portugal is a much poorer country, and there are many more poor people. in terms of the national data set, the international data set, the SILT data, it's quite possible that there are some, well, we need to say put some caveats on that, because it's quite possible that some alone parents were kind of hidden in multi-generational households. So it's possible that they are underestimated, or that lone parents actually have much more access to other family members to help them in Portugal, you know, people that live nearby. And we did, I mean, in the qualitative data, we did find some evidence for that, because we did find that in the UK, people are less likely to rely on their kin for help, or to have kin living nearby. Whereas in Portugal, it was often a kind of part and parcel of everyday life. People used to go regularly on Sundays, for example, and eat together as a family. So, or the children would go to their grandparents in the holidays and so forth. So there was perhaps more, in this study, more kind of convivial sharing of food, which may have mitigated some of the effects of poverty, particularly amongst the lone parents. I mean, it's a complicated picture, but in the UK, it's clearly, you know, one person household, and the people who were on low incomes, if they were in work, you know, mothers were on excessively low incomes, and those who weren't employed, you know, were on benefits that had been drastically cut back under the austerity measures of the Conservative government. Do you want to add to that, Rebecca?
No, I think you've covered it. I think the depth of poverty of lone parent families in the UK is part, you know, of the explanation for why we see that big gap. So we have two parent families who we discuss in the book who are also food poor, but the lone parent families were experiencing, you know, were deprived in many material ways. And I think, as Julia said, it's about the depths of poverty in the UK and about cuts that have particularly affected lone parent families.
Thank you very much. You mentioned the data and statistics on which you based the studies. I believe you mentioned an EU-wide study. Could you just remind us what that is called, and is it freely and openly available for anybody that might be interested?
I think it's available, isn't it? It's the European Union Statistics of Income and Living Conditions survey, and it's a cross-sectional survey. So we looked at it at different points in time. Well, we had some, part of our research team did the analysis. Yeah,
and it's available from Eurostat. So I think you have to register, and you know, there's steps you have to go through, but it's open data, I think, in that sense. And we also used a study, some data from a study called the Health Behaviour in School-Aged Children study, and that has different kind of access requirements. So, but the EU statistics on income and living conditions are available to researchers.
But they're the items on food poverty are quite limited. You know, they are, I mean, it's one central item with whether people can afford a protein meal every second day.
Yes, so it's very good on income, you know, indicators and so forth, but less good on food, as you find with these secondary analysis.
which makes depth of analysis and using other methods and looking at it in different ways and very, really important.
Shall I finish up with this few points? I'm not sure if you're speaking, Catherine, but I can't hear you.
Yes, I am. Excuse me. Sorry.
Sorry.
I have a microphone that mutes and a Zoom account that mutes as well. So it just confused me for a second. So are there any plans for any future work building upon this work that you've been doing and perhaps looking more in depth into the effects of COVID-19?
We haven't designed any research that's looking at the effect of COVID on these families as yet. We are having a book launch in a few weeks, which we'll send around details of, and we're going to invite, well, we have invited the researchers from Portugal and from Norway to come and say a few words on their reflections on the pandemic in each country and how that's particularly affected those families who, like the families in our study who are on low incomes. But we haven't designed any research to look particularly at these families or their experiences of COVID. There's lots of research going on in the UK at the moment on those issues.
It's quite, well, there are lots of ethical issues around following up people in a particular study. And in any case, some of our families were, we wouldn't be able to contact them because, they were facing eviction and so on. And also it's likely that, that their situations would be even worse than they were when we interviewed them. So, so if you were thinking, talking about following up particular families, but I do think, the kinds of strategies that were carried out in this research of getting these groups as just, to get a full picture of what's happening is really important.
Thank you. We have another question here from Alison Briggs, who is asking, you mentioned mothers reported skipping meals to ensure children were fed, and she's wondering whether this was across all 3 countries or unique to just 1 or 2.
That was across all 3 countries. I think that's, if it's not universal, it's almost universal. I think anthropologists and sociologists have found over the decades, as Julia has said. I think something that's quite interesting that that comes out particularly in the UK research was mothers going without their own material necessities, including food, to protect their children's social participation. So, for example, the mother Lauren that we called Lauren that Julia spoke about earlier talked about her own experiences as a poor child, not having the right trainers, and basically would go without things to make sure that her children did have the right trainers. So it throws up questions when you start to think about hierarchies of needs and so forth, that it does happen that parents will go without material necessities to protect children's social necessities. We had another mother who had no recourse to public funds in the UK, who was living on £20 a week, and she gave half of that to her daughter to take to school so that her daughter wouldn't be ashamed in front of her friends, would be able to buy things. So I think it probably, the priorities manifest and play out in different ways in different places, but certainly it was something that we found across all the countries. Yeah.
I mean, one example, I suppose, is that quite a lot of the parents would give, in the UK in particular, gave extra money to their children so that to spend at school for lunch, so that they didn't look, you know, like they were being deprived because they were free school meals or whatever. But the children often themselves would save that money to use it for other things, so that they didn't then have to ask their parents for money.
Mm.
So it kind of works two ways, you know. The children collude with this, as well as the mothers actually.
They moderated their needs, didn't they? I think, yeah.
Okay. So I think that you were also going to introduce your recent studies to us as well. Certainly I've read myself the Hand to Fork study, I believe it was, which
Yeah.
is an extremely hard-hitting study. It really brings home what families are facing. And I think that this would be fantastic. I mean, everybody really should read this. But if you'd like to introduce them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, we were going to finish up by thanking you for coming. Thank you for inviting us, and to say that the book that we've been talking about will be published on the 24th of May, and that's going to be available as an open access book, so that can be downloaded for free. We wrote a book, Julia, Abigail and I wrote up the findings focused on the children in the UK and their families and their experiences of food poverty. And we worked with the Child Poverty Action Group in coming up with some recommendations and in publishing and promoting that book, and that's also available for free to download from the Child Poverty Action Group's website. You can buy the real book as well if you prefer. And we will send around a link via you, Kate, to our book launch, which will be on Wednesday the 9th of June at lunchtime in the UK. And we have a few speakers who will come and talk at the launch, including on the right to food and the researchers from the other two countries, as I already mentioned. I think you might be muted again, Catherine.
I'm on mute again.
You were.
That would be fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca. If you could pass on the details, and we'll make sure that the whole working group has access to that, presuming that everybody's invited. And thank you very much for coming here to share your research with us today. For our participants, we have been recording this, and we will be making this available for you to watch at your leisure later on. If you do have any questions, then please do get in touch with us via the working group or via any of the email addresses that we've given you today. And thank you so much. So thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Julia, for coming and sharing this fascinating research with us. And we'll see everybody in the near future. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.